Do you hear it? The sound, low and endless, like breath caught between stone and sand. I hear it still. Even now, far from the desert, the whisper follows me. And if you are listening, perhaps it follows you too. My name is no longer important. What matters is the night I crossed into the valley where the pharaohs slept. The sand there does not shift like other sands. It listens. It waits. And when the wind dies, the silence presses against the skin, as though the desert itself is leaning close, eager to hear your last word. I was a scholar once. A man who thought history was quiet. But history breathes. And the dead never forget. We had heard of an unbroken tomb. Whispers in Cairo's market spoke of it, as though the story itself was afraid of daylight. They said the pharaoh cursed even his own name, hiding it, blotting it from memory. I should have listened. But the promise of discovery is a cruel master. Our camp lay beneath a broken ridge of stone, jagged like teeth against the horizon. The nights were long, the fire small, and the desert, never silent. Jackals called to one another, yet sometimes, they laughed. The sound was too human to belong to any beast. The men whispered among themselves, though their voices thinned each night. Some swore they saw lanterns moving where no camp stood. Others said they woke to find sand pressed against their lips, as though the desert tried to fill their mouths to silence their breathing. And I began to hear it too. The whisper. Never clear. Never loud. But always close. At first I told myself it was my own mind fraying at the edges. The wind, the fatigue, the weight of anticipation. But then came the nights when I woke and the sand around my tent bore footprints. Not mine. Not any man's. Bare. Narrow. Pressed deep, as though whoever walked there was heavier than flesh could bear. I stopped sleeping soon after. For when I closed my eyes, I dreamt of eyes carved in stone, staring, watching, waiting. And when I woke, I felt their gaze still on me. What if the dead do not sleep, but wait? What if a tomb is not a grave but a door? And what if the door was opening? There was an old guide with us, Harun. His voice cracked like dry reeds when he spoke. He told me that his grandfather had once disturbed a minor tomb near Giza. He took trinkets, gold, and amulets. Riches enough to feed a family for a year. By the next moon, Harun's grandfather was found dead, his tongue bitten through, his hands clutched at his throat as though he had swallowed smoke. The amulets turned to dust when they buried him. Harun leaned close that night, the fire painting hollows into his face, and whispered, "The sand does not forgive." I laughed then, softly, though the sound died in my own throat. Because even as I laughed, I heard the whisper. Louder. Closer. If you heard footsteps circling your bed at night, slow, deliberate, stopping just beyond the edge of darkness, what would you do? The morning we found the entrance, the sun rose red, not the red of dawn, but of blood watered into dust. And there was the door. Stone carved with eyes. Hundreds of them. Staring. Watching. Following. That night, as the wind fell silent, I sat alone with my lantern. And I swear to you, the eyes shifted. Ever so slightly. Following me. More stories in the dark? Hit subscribe. If this one kept you awake, the next is darker. Check the pinned comment. Where are you listening from? And what time of night is it? Do you feel it? The way air grows heavy before a storm. That was how the desert felt the night we touched the tomb. The sands had shifted around the stone entrance, revealing a carved lintel buried for centuries. Hieroglyphs stared back, their lines sharp, too sharp for their age. They spoke of a curse, though my companions dismissed it as ritual language. But there was something in the air. The wind no longer blew across the dunes. Instead, it seemed to draw inward, as though the tomb itself were breathing. Inside the camp, firelight flickered strangely. The shadows on the tent walls stretched tall, elongated, and bent at wrong angles. I told myself it was only the flames, only the night, yet my chest tightened. I began to notice the others acting differently. The professor, once skeptical of superstition, spoke in whispers, pausing between his words as though someone were listened in. The young guide, who sang folk songs to ease the silence, no longer sang. He sat with his back to the tomb, trembling, muttering prayers in Arabic. And at night, I could swear someone paced outside my tent. Slow steps. Sand shifting. But each time I pulled aside the flap, there was nothing. Only the dunes rolling endlessly beneath the moonlight. Sleep came shallow. And when I dreamed of halls lined with statues, their eyes alive, following me. What if it wasn't the dead we disturbed, but something that had never truly been alive? Something waiting in the dark for us to open the door? The heat of the day turned unnatural. At noon, the sun burned too bright, and mirages shimmered across the sand. But in those mirages I didn't see palm trees or water. I saw faces. Dozens of faces, screaming, their mouths full of sand. We tried to push onward with excavation, chiseling stone, and moving sandbags. The work drained us. But when I paused, listening, I realized something horrifying. The tools no longer made the right sounds. The pickaxe struck stone, but it rang hollow like metal hitting bone. The brushes swept sand, but the sound was like whispers brushing past my ears. And then the smell came. A faint sweetness, like dried flowers left too long in a tomb. Incense and rot. I recognized it from funeral parlors. The tomb was opening itself. Tell me, if you stood at the mouth of an ancient tomb and heard breath on the back of your neck, would you step inside? Or would you run, never looking back? That night, I woke to find the professor gone. His cot was empty, the lantern overturned. Following faint light, I saw him kneeling at the tomb's sealed door, tracing the hieroglyphs with bloodied fingers. He was whispering, not in English, not in Arabic, but in a language so old my ears strained to comprehend it. The symbols on the stone shifted, glistening like wet paint. The carved eyes seemed to open. And then, a sound. Not from the professor, not from any of us. A long hollow sigh. The tomb exhaled. The sand trembled. The door cracked. Something ancient moved within the darkness, as though rising from a bed it had been forced to lie in for millennia. I wanted to scream. Instead I whispered, "We should not be here. If you felt the tomb's breath tonight, stay with me." The next chapter opens the door wider. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories whispered in the dark. They say shadows cling only where light dares to touch. But in the tomb, the shadows moved on their own, even when no flame was lit. We carried lanterns as the tomb door groaned open. The air that escaped was not stale, it was damp and warm, as if we had opened the lungs of a slumbering beast. The stone steps descended, cut at an angle too precise for human hands. Our guide refused to enter, muttering curses and leaving us behind. So it was only the professor, myself, and two others. Our lanterns painted trembling circles on walls painted with scenes of conquest and ritual. The figures were not merely drawings. Their eyes bulged, glistening with mineral that seemed wet to the touch. And then the smell. Not death. Not decay. But resin, perfumes, the cloying sweetness of embalmed flesh. It was as though the burial rites had been performed yesterday. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally. One sound split into many until I swore a procession followed us. I stopped listening. Behind us, the lantern light quivered. The professor hushed me, pressing forward, scribbling translations of the hieroglyphs. He muttered they were prayers, yet the way he spoke them, it sounded less like translation and more like invocation. Deeper still, we found the first chamber. Columns rose like petrified trees, carved with figures bowing to a throne. Upon the throne sat a pharaoh, but the face had been chiseled away, deliberately erased. The professor whispered, "Erased from history. A king forbidden from memory." But I saw something worse. The shadow of the throne still bore ahead. What do you do when shadows remember what history has forgotten? We pressed into the burial hall. Coffers lined the walls, sealed but trembling as though something within shifted. The air thickened, hot and cold at once. The second man, Thomas, claimed he heard chanting. None of us spoke, yet his eyes darted wildly. He swore it came from the coffers, dozens of voices humming deep beneath the stone lids. I tried to calm him, but as I laid a hand on his arm, he recoiled, his skin fevered, his pupils wide. He whispered, "They know our names." And then laughter. Not loud. Not human. It rose from the darkness like a trickle of water, dry and rasping, weaving between the pillars. We ran. But the laughter followed. If you stood in a hall of sealed coffers, and one began to laugh, would you open it to silence the sound? Or flee, never daring to look back? At the far end we found the sarcophagus chamber. The walls shimmered with gold leaf, flaking but radiant. The sarcophagus itself loomed massive, carved from black basalt, veined with red like dried blood. The lid bore the image of the pharaoh, his erased face restored in paint that glowed faintly in lantern light. The professor dropped to his knees, trembling. He touched the stone, whispering, "He still breathes." At that moment Thomas screamed. His lantern crashed. In its dying glow we saw his shadow, split from his body. It moved independently, stretching and slithering toward the sarcophagus. We pulled him back, but his shadow did not follow. It knelt at the sarcophagus, merging with the painted face, filling the void where features had been erased. The pharaoh had found a vessel. If you heard the pharaoh's laughter tonight, stay close. The next chapter opens the sarcophagus, and something older than death steps into the light. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. More shadows wait in the dark. Do you hear that? Not the wind, not the sand. It is the sound of stone shifting, as something inside the sarcophagus tries to rise. We circled the sarcophagus, our lanterns trembling in unison, though no draft stirred the chamber. The professor's hands bled from pressing against the stone, tracing symbols with his own flesh. He muttered words I could not place, syllables harsh and wet, as though they belonged to a tongue never meant for breathing men. The lid moved. Not with our strength, but with a steady, pulsing rhythm like the chest of a sleeper drawing breath. I wanted to flee, to abandon the chamber to its silence. But something in the air held me fast, as though invisible hands pressed against my shoulders, forcing me to witness. Thomas clung to me, his shadow still absent, his body trembling as though hollowed out. His skin was pale, his lips dry, yet his eyes glowed faintly, as if another flame burned within him. The second companion, Elias, whispered prayers under his breath. But each line he spoke came back wrong. He prayed for light, and the chamber grew darker. He prayed for silence, and the whispers grew louder. He prayed for mercy, and something laughed. The laughter was not human, not beast. It was the scrape of stone on stone, the creak of wood bending under centuries of weight. It filled my chest with ice. And then the smell returned, stronger now. Sweet resin, clotted blood, and rot beneath perfume. What do you do when the dead no longer wait for your permission to rise? The professor cried out as the lid shifted, toppling with a thunderous crack. Dust and smoke erupted, but not choking, sweet, intoxicating, and laced with incense. Inside the pharaoh lay, not mummified, not decayed. His flesh was waxen, smooth, untouched by time. His eyes were closed, lips sealed as though in perfect sleep. But he breathed. Slow, deliberate, each breath a sigh that made the chamber quake. The painted face on the lid glowed, alive with shadow. And I realized, Thomas's missing shade had given it form. The pharaoh opened his eyes. They were not the eyes of a man. They were pits of darkness, rimmed with fire, pulling every flicker of lantern light into their depths. Elias screamed, dropping his prayer. His own shadow peeled from him, dragging itself across the floor, clawing toward the coffin like a starving animal. If you stood before a king who had slept for 3,000 years, and he opened his eyes to hunger, would you bow or would you run? The pharaoh's chest rose higher, ribs straining against the wrappings. The sound of cracking bones echoed, yet his face never winced. With one motion he sat upright. The golden inlays of the chamber flared, casting the walls in molten light. Hieroglyphs writhed, changing before my eyes, prayers twisting into curses, blessings into threats. The professor fell prostrate, offering his body, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Take me, master. Take me." The pharaoh reached, not with hands of flesh, but with a tide of shadow that poured from the coffin like ink in water. It touched Elias first. His scream cut short, his skin collapsing inward as though hollowed from the inside. His shadow merged with the tide. And then Thomas, the hollow man, smiled. The pharaoh had already claimed him. I alone remained untouched, lantern sputtering, lungs choking on incense. The pharaoh's gaze turned to me, his voice entering my skull without breath, without sound. "You open my door. Now, you will carry me out." If you felt the pharaoh's hunger tonight, you are not alone. The next chapter follows me beyond the tomb, where his curse spreads into the living world. Subscribe, and walk with me deeper into the dark. Have you ever left a room, and felt the room follow you? That is how it was, when I stepped out of the tomb. The pharaoh walked with me. We staggered into the desert night, but I was not alone. Elias was gone, hollowed out like a husk. Thomas's body lived, but his soul was chained to the pharaoh. And the professor, he no longer spoke as himself. He murmured in the tongue of the dead, his lips cracked and bleeding, eyes glazed with devotion. He carried relics taken from the tomb, clutching them as though they were sacred scripture. The guide, who had waited outside, screamed at the sight of us. He fell to his knees, pressing his forehead into the sand, praying louder than the wind itself. But when he looked up, his prayer caught in his throat, for he saw the shadow behind me. A shadow taller than I, crowned and cloaked, walking where no man stood. The desert had changed. The dunes no longer shifted with the breeze. Instead, they lay frozen, sculpted into shapes, faces, arms, and writhing bodies of sand, all reaching upward as though in agony. The air was colder now. Each breath frosted in my throat. The stars above flickered and dimmed, one by one as if swallowed by an unseen hand. The guide fled, sprinting toward the horizon, his voice breaking with prayer. For a time I thought he might escape. But then the sand opened. His scream cut off as the desert swallowed him whole, leaving not even a ripple behind. The Pharaoh did not need to chase. The desert itself obeyed him. What if the land itself remembers a master, and bends to serve him even after 3,000 years of silence? We pressed onward through the night, lanterns dimming, footsteps endless. Yet no matter how far we walked, the tomb seemed always near. I turned once to mark the horizon, only to see the stone door glowing faintly, no more than 100 paces behind us. Time dissolved. Hours felt like days. The professor bled from the nose, chanting without pause. Thomas did not blink, his smile fixed, his skin stretched too tight across his skull. And me? I began to hear the Pharaoh's voice inside my thoughts. Not loud, not commanding, but soft, almost tender. You are mine now. You will carry me beyond the sands. You will feed me until the world remembers my name. I tried to resist, tried to recall my own name. But the harder I thought of myself, the faster it slipped away, letters scattering like grains of sand in the wind. Tell me, if you heard a voice in your head, soft and calm, whispering your name until it was no longer your own, would you fight to remember? Or let it take you and finally rest? The desert village came into view by dawn. Mud brick houses clustered at the edge of the dunes, smoke rising faintly from cooking fires. Children ran through the alleys, their laughter sharp against the silence of night. But when they saw us, their joy died. Mothers pulled them inside, doors slammed and shutters barred. The professor staggered forward, holding aloft a relic, a golden scarab pulled from the tomb. His voice thundered, not his own, proclaiming, "Wow, he has returned." And then the wells of the village bled. Water turned black, bubbling, stinking of rot. Goats shrieked, collapsing where they stood. And every shadow in the village bent. Not east, not west, but toward him. I felt my body move without command. My feet carried me to the center of the square, my hands outstretched as though in worship. And from within me, though my lips never moved, his voice spoke. This world is mine again. If the Pharaoh's shadow reached you tonight, stay close. The final chapter waits. His hunger has only begun. Subscribe, and do not wander alone in the dark. Do you know what it feels like? To forget the sound of your own voice? That is how the Pharaoh claimed me. By silence. The village had fallen still. The wells festered, the animals lay dead, and the air carried the perfume of rot. Yet no one screamed. No one fled. Instead they knelt. Every man, woman, and child bent low in the dust, their shadows stretching long toward the figure that loomed behind me. I felt him inside me, his pulse, his breath, his hunger, threading itself into my bones. My fingers twitched with movements that were not mine. My lips trembled with words I did not choose. The professor spoke only one phrase over and over. The night returns. The night returns. The night returns. Darkness fell, though the sun still burned overhead. A veil of black crept across the sky, blotting out the light as though painted by an unseen hand. The stars appeared at midday, swirling in patterns no astronomer would recognize. The villagers whispered prayers, but their voices carried no sound. Their lips moved, their throats strained, yet silence devoured every syllable. I tried to shout, to break the stillness, but the Pharaoh pressed down on my chest, stilling even my breath. He did not need their prayers. Their silence was enough. And then the dead came. Not from the tomb, but from the village itself. Fathers who had drowned in the wells, mothers buried in the sandstorms, and children lost to fever. Their shadows rose first, crawling across the ground like ink, before dragging the bodies upright to walk again. What do you do when the dead you once loved return to bow, not to you but to something that wears your skin? The Pharaoh's voice grew louder in my mind. His hunger sharpened. He spoke of kingdoms long lost, of armies buried beneath dunes, of rivers turned to blood in his name. He promised me eternity if I yielded, if I let him take what little remained of myself. No more pain, he whispered. No more fear. Only my night, endless and calm. I felt my will shatter like brittle clay. My memories slipped. My mother's face, the laughter of friends, even the sound of my own name. All of it washed away in the tide of him. And yet, a fragment remained. A whisper of myself, small but sharp, like a splinter lodged in the flesh of eternity. If you had the choice, to surrender yourself and live forever in silence, or fight knowing you would die screaming, which would you choose? The Pharaoh rose behind me, his form no longer shadow but flesh, reborn through my body, through the villagers' silence, through the shadows that poured like rivers around his feet. He towered, crowned in fire, draped in darkness. The stars above bent into his constellation, rewriting the heavens. The professor collapsed, his final breath leaving as ash. Thomas stood still, empty, a puppet strung by invisible threads. And me. I felt the last of myself unraveling, dissolving into the vast, eternal night he carried within. But before it vanished, I clung to one thought, one final rebellion. A whisper not for him but for you. If you are hearing this, it means some fragment of me escaped. Perhaps only a shadow. Perhaps only a voice, carried on the breath of the Pharaoh himself. But beware. If his shadow touches your room tonight, if you feel the air grow heavy, if you hear a sigh in the dark, it means he has found you. And when he does, there will be no dawn. If this story kept you awake, subscribe for darker nights await. And if you dare, check the pinned comment. The next tale waits there, whispering.